Welcome to Testable Faith. My name is George Haraxon. I serve here at Reasons to Believe as a Scholar Community Director and a staff scholar. And I'm here with visiting scholar, Dr. Brian Huffling. So welcome, Brian. You are a philosopher and you teach in that at Southern Evangelical Seminary. Tell us a little bit about what you do there and maybe your other roles too.
Okay, so I teach nowadays mostly philosophy. I'm the director of the PhD program there. I'm a reserve chaplain with the Air Force. I've been in different church staffs, youth pastor, associate pastor, that kind of thing. Yeah, just plugging away.
Just plugging away. You can't decide on one thing. You got to be philosopher,
that's right,
chaplain.
I teach for Apologia, which is we offer classes for homeschoolers. I teach philosophy for them as well.
Okay. That's an interesting thing, because a lot of people think of philosophy and they think, I'm going to have to think really hard, or this is going to be over my head.
Yeah.
But you do that, but obviously apply it for the students that you're teaching. How do you make it practical in that sense?
Well, it is true. So you don't normally see philosophy courses at that level.
Yeah.
In fact, even the Aristotle says, don't even do this till you're like 35. So I try to do it where it makes it interesting to them. They are having to deal with these issues anyway, so why not take it head on? And one of the courses is logic, and so we learn informal fallacies, how to make an argument, how to evaluate arguments, how to take some literature and say, okay, where is the argument here, and what do you do with it? How do you make it, see if it's good or bad?
So critical thinking.
Critical thinking, right? We try to look at things like God's existence, the problem of evil. I'm using R.C. Sproul's book, The Consequences of Ideas, to see, given these main currents of thought, what's the outcome of that thought? So if we take atheism, then what follows from that? If we take this view of philosophy, even within Christianity, what flows from that?
You laugh at this, for my class. Do you remember Bazooka Joe bubblegum?
Yes.
The gum would come with a comic strip. And one of them said, Bazooka Joe says, ideas have consequences. And he says, only if you act on them.
I need to get one of those for my class.
That was philosophical. Well, one of the things you just hit upon there was the issue of God's existence.
Right.
And so we can talk about different kinds of arguments for God's existence. And I would imagine as a philosopher, you distinguish between philosophical arguments for God's existence and then maybe scientific arguments for God's existence.
Mm-hmm.
Let me set this up a little bit. At least when I teach philosophy or talk about philosophy, a lot of textbooks will use, at least that I have seen, the distinction between a priori and a posteriori arguments. Now, those are Latin terms, and they just simply mean a priori is apart from or before sense experience. So you rely on reason or rationality, whereas a posteriori relies on empirical evidence, or what we might call scientific evidence. Can you talk about that more? Because that's part of the distinction between philosophical and scientific.
Sure. So a purely philosophical argument that supposedly doesn't deal with anything in nature would be something like, I guess, the Anselmian ontological argument that says God is a being that which none greater can be thought. It is better to be outside the mind than just inside the mind. And therefore, God must exist outside the mind, because if he was just in the mind, you could conceive of another being outside the mind being greater, therefore he wouldn't be the greatest. So that would be a purely a priori kind of argument. You can have philosophical arguments that are a posteriori if they're more like cosmological, like Thomas Aquinas' arguments would be cosmological and a posteriori based on the nature of the universe, being contingent, for example. So if you have change, or in his second way, he says, everything that exists has to have a cause, and that can't go back forever. So there must be some ultimate cause that itself isn't caused. Now, way back in those days, philosophy used to be considered a science. So when we use the word science here, I mean more naturalistic science, like biology and chemistry and physics. And there are a lot of really good arguments for God from biology, and my particular interest is in more astronomy. But the more I see with biology and astronomy, the more amazing the arguments get every day. Some of the critiques with that, or some of the differences, if you start with a natural science that studies nature. So if God exists, if you think he's a theistic kind of God, or he's the creator of all nature, he can't be part of nature, so he would be supernatural. So we need some kind of move to get us from the realm of nature to the realm of the supernatural. And so we get very practical, very strong arguments from, say, biochemistry, cosmology, about everything being designed, and the amazing complexity that we see in cells, for example, and the design of the universe. And depending on the argument, it would take a little more philosophical boost, I guess, to get to that supernatural realm. But they're very powerful arguments on the scientific side.
So from the scientific side, one way, I guess, to put it is, to build a scientific argument, you kind of got to get out of your chair and get evidence from
right.
the world.
So the philosopher, one of my professors used to say, my kids can't tell if I'm working or taking a nap. So to be a scientist, my wife is in science education, and so she would need microscopes. Scientists would need a telescope, or things to do experiments with. So you're actually doing more inductive analysis of things in the world as a scientist, and saying, well, we have X, Y, and Z here, and we don't normally see X, Y, and Z unless we see A, B, and C, being something like a designer. So whenever we see this kind of design, like in a watch, the Paley's watchmaker analogy, there's got to be some kind of a maker of the watch. So we see something in nature, in creation, that we say, when we see this, we always see intelligence. So once we see the cell or the eye or the brain or whatever, we see another level of intelligence that must be required to account for what we see in the natural order.
I'm sure many people's minds will want to go right now to the content of these arguments that you're talking about, but we're talking more about the arguments.
The nature of them, right?
Yeah, the nature of the arguments, the difference between them.
The content's y'all. I don't have the content for those.
Bring back Hugh. Are these different arguments, the philosophical, the scientific, or a priori, a posteriori, are they limited and constrained? I think that's what you had mentioned. So if I'm building a scientific argument, it might get me to an intelligence, but not a hypernatural or supernatural God. Am I hearing that correctly?
So some of the arguments, it depends on what they are and how they're made. Some of the critique would be, well, that doesn't get you like a design argument. It doesn't necessarily get you creation ex nihilo. It gets you a designer. It might not tell you how many designers there are, so it might not get you monotheism or creation ex nihilo. It depends on how the argument's structured, how it's argued. Whereas a philosophical argument attempts to get at the nature of reality and saying that all of reality, given what it is contingent and cannot account for its own existence. Therefore, all of reality would need a transcendent cause. Whereas for the intelligent designer, which I think, again, are very, very strong, you could have an intelligent designer, at least hypothetically, within the created order. It might not be a very good way of answering the argument, because, you're going to have to ultimately get that thing also has to be designed. But that's going to be some of the critiques of it.
Okay. Where would you put something like religious experience? Some people think that there are arguments from religious experience to God, or just appeal to religious experience as a way to know God.
Okay.
What would you?
So I think people can probably have some kind of experiences. The problem with it is they're very subjective, and it's hard to latch onto an objective test for whether or not that either is from God or whether it is from something else. So I've seen people of other faiths have an experience in front of me, like I had a Mormon breakdown crying, giving his testimony. We wouldn't want to say that their experience is an indicator of the truth of their position. So experience can be good in some regard, but it's dangerous if we want to say that I had this experience, therefore I'm going to base all my beliefs on it. So it could be used maybe for that own person's subjective knowledge, but even then it can be very, very difficult to discern if it's truly from God or some other deceptive source.
Okay, well, let me push on this a little bit. So my grandmother lived with us for a long time, and she was eventually into her 90s, but she didn't have a chance. She actually never learned to drive. She lived in Manhattan.
Okay. I wouldn't drive there either.
Yeah. She never had really an opportunity to take a philosophy class or that, but she seemed to have a profound faith and experience with God.
Oh, I didn't mean. Oh, sure. I see what you're saying.
I'm not saying you're dismissing that, but it might be a way, would you affirm the distinction? A lot of people know God, or Christians know God. They know God, but it's different than showing
Yes.
that God.
For example, Aquinas says it's not necessary to be able to give a logical demonstration, but some people have faith, they have this relationship, and they're not. So for people to be philosophers, historically, you have to have the means by which to do that. So Plato and Aristotle were aristocratic. Thomas was a monk and had people take care of him. So not everyone either has the luxury of being able just to study things they want to, or for whatever reason just don't. And so, yeah, absolutely, people, well, my grandma was the same way. She wouldn't have the philosophical background which she had. She surpasses me greatly in her own experience and walk with God. She's just a testimony to me about what it looks like, and so I try to emulate that.
What was interesting is I had very good philosophical actual discussions with my grandmother on things, even though she wasn't trained formally or anything on that. Another aspect of this, so might some of this also be, in one sense, and this is like moving into psychology, but we gravitate towards different arguments, kind of based on our personality. Some people are really excited about the scientific evidence. Others, maybe like us, really enjoy arguments, philosophical arguments like the ontological argument, maybe the moral argument, things like that. What would you talk about that?
Yeah, that's great, because we get people from different walks. So I thank God for you guys who are doing this here, the scientific stuff. That's just not what I'm good at. I'm not good at math and science. I mean, I just have not gone down that road. I wish I would have sometimes and went down that path, but it's great to hear what you guys are doing with intelligent design arguments. I like the cosmological arguments a lot. One argument that I think I would like to learn more about is I went with my wife onto a trip one time. She was chaperoning her class while she was getting her master's degree, and it was a Body Works exhibit at Discovery Place, and it was where they had preserved Body Works. Is they had an exhibition of dead bodies, people who had given their bodies over to science, and people would study them. And you could come out and look at the different systems, the skeletal system, the muscular system, and they had all kind of different scenarios there. And what really impressed me about that was that these bodies are just material things. They cannot really account for consciousness. It's just an amazing thing that we have consciousness and can think the way we do. And I don't think that the materialist answer to that makes a lot of sense. And so seeing that made me think, well, this is a really amazing argument that's, in my view, not talked about enough.
The argument from consciousness
right.
to God. And
right.
I think J.P. Moreland has
I was thinking about him in particular, right.
On that. And that would be that's a philosophical.
It is a philosophical argument, right.
Because you're arguing that there is a reality called consciousness, but that what has that consciousness is either physical or something immaterial.
Right. So it's the nature of reality.
And what has brought that into being, or is the cause of that.
Sure. Right.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. We're so glad to have you here.
Good to be here.
Now, especially for me, I'm working with a lot of scientists, and we have great conversations, back and forth, and so we learn from each other's disciplines.
That's right.
Yeah. So I want to thank you. If you want to learn more from Dr. Brian Huffling, please go to reasons.org and search Brian Huffling, and you can explore his resources there.